Bear with me, we're trying something new. Hi there, I'm Miss Pearl, and hopefully I am slightly more audible than usual. If you see me looking to the side, I blame the fact that I'm looking at a tiny version of myself, and it's very distracting to have a screen there, so you may see a lot of whoop. And the topic that I will be live streaming about today is going to be the whole ace identity thing and how it squares with me. Now, you might be seeing off to the side there is, whoops, wrong hand, it's mirrored, a gray ace flag, and I'm going to have to define some terms to you. Ace and asexual refers to a spectrum of different possible approaches to orientation. You've probably heard of the concept of asexual, as in having no sexuality whatsoever. And this is a valid definition, but when you're talking about whether or not someone is asexual or ace, it gets a little bit more complicated in that you can talk about them as being aspec, gray ace, demisexual. There's a little bit more scope, and that's not even when you're going into the subject of whether or not something is someone is aromantic, and that would mean that they might have sexuality, they just do not have the ability to form romantic attachment. That's just not how they do. And I thought this one was worth bringing up because I'd noticed a few things about the subject of ace and kink. Now, for me, this was a little bit one of those little stepped things, and I'm going to give you a content warning of clueless person discovering, oh, that's a thing. When I first encountered asexuality, like most good, open-minded, left-wing progressive types, my response was jolly good. Yes, I can respect that some people don't want to have sexuality. They may not even be repulsed by it. They just don't want it. And then I had it explained to me, no, 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 no. People who are asexual may still want to have sex. And that was explained to me because, for example, they care about the partner and they may get things that are not sexual out of it. And I was like, well, that takes all types. I guess I can internalize that. And then it was explained to me, no, 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 no. Some asexual people may continue to masturbate and enjoy the act of sex itself. And for me, I was like, what? Does that count as asexual? This is a little confusing. And luckily for me, I had lots of patient people who had time to explain, no, asexuality can refer to merely not having attraction to people in the sense that you might say someone is gay or they're straight or they're bisexual or they're pansexual, that they might see someone and be attracted to them in that sense. If you're demisexual, you might only be attracted to someone after you formed a strong romantic bond. And if you're graysexual, that refers to a whole scope of different possible interpretations. Either that your sexual attraction is so rare, whoops, something in the eye, of course there is. Your sexual attraction is so rare that it's usually not a factor that comes up, or possibly that your sexual attraction or sexual desire only works in certain circumstances. And I fall under the spectrum of gray ace, and this was one of those things where I realized that it could apply to a lot of fetishists. And again, here's a little term thing that I'm going to have to be a little flexible with. Strictly speaking, when you talk about fetish, we both mean it in the general vernacular, which means interchangeable for the word kink, but you can also use it to mean an attraction in exclusion to what you would consider normal sexuality. Now, the whole concept of normal sexuality in itself is going to be a little nebulous, so apologies if this is not as well thought out as some things might be. I am not an expert. I am not a skilled sex educator. This is what it is. Anywho, when you're going to talk about someone's attraction to things in terms of a fetish, the other thing that doesn't help is that the terminology that people have come up with for fetishes has by and large not been chosen by the fetishists. It's been chosen by psychiatrists and psychologists trying to explain what is this person and what are they doing? And modern psychiatry is pretty clear that a paraphilic disorder is basically when the person is compulsively unable to avoid it, or they're finding it's like an intrusive thought for them, and that's not the same thing as, oh, I'm kind of really horny, because those sorts of thoughts are not distressing them. Psychiatry very much leans on the idea that there's no such thing as a sexual addiction. You can have compulsive behaviors that you're doing, but it tends to be part of a larger, broader spectrum, that it's dangerous to say sexual addiction, much like we don't have nymphomania in any sort of modern psychiatry because of its strong history of being applied to basically mean having the sex that you don't like. Now, If you've been stuck on social media for the last little while, which is pretty much everyone in this doom scrolling hellscape who has access to internet, you've probably seen that since June is Pride Month for a good part of the world, that a significant part of the internet has decided to open up the subject of whether or not kink should be permitted at Pride. And you might wonder, what does that have to do with talking about asexuality? And if you've been listening to me rant a lot and do my angry twitterings, you probably may have realized that I both fall firmly in the camp of, yes, kink belongs at Pride, and kink belongs at Pride for a number of reasons, which you're probably sick to death at having argued to you, and it's not even Pride properly yet. But in addition to that, one of the reasons why kink belongs at Pride is a common way that asexuality is expressed is people to whom both their ability to have sexuality and their ability to have romantic desire for someone are both posited on the presence of there being kinks. And for me, I had to think about the entire history of my sexuality, and that is me. I cannot have functional long-term sexuality unless it involves my kinks. And it's rather funny because I consider myself a fairly sexual person. I've had an active libido as long as I've had puberty been there. And I've certainly been capable of falling in love with people, but that's very notably the experience. I've never been able to be properly, for lack of a better term, slutty. I've tried to look into the concept of a one-night stand, and wouldn't this be great? And I grew up in an environment where this thing was very recognized as being a good idea, you'd want to do it, and all I would ever find with it is it would be awkward and painful, and I'd kind of back out of it because it wasn't doing anything for me and there was no arousal there, which was very hard to reconcile with the idea of what I thought sex was supposed to be like versus how it seemed to be. Now, for me, one of the other huge problems with having my sexuality oriented around both fetishes and to whom I'm in love with, in the latter case, most of the writing about love tends to phrase things in terms of the person being demisexual if you're reading things like romance novels. There's a shocking number of stories where the heroine's sexuality really only begins the first time she falls in love with the hero, and I don't know why this conceit is so popular in romance novels, but it is what it is. Even if you're reading something like god-awful 50 Shades of Grey, bless it. It's not high art, but it's very typical of its form. She immediately only starts masturbating when she discovers a person that she starts to fall in love with. So part of the inability to recognize what this was, as far as demisexuality, was me not realizing this wasn't how it worked for most people. Now, we have a dearth of honest, good information about human sexuality. We have an environment where we only discovered the entirety, or at least most of what we think is there, of the female clitoris, well, I suppose the male clitoris too, or the non-binary clitoris, within this century. That was the other side of the 2000s, that they mapped out this wishbone-y shaped butterfly thing that's internal to everybody who has the whole vulva-vagina set. Science had a hell of a time getting a bisexual man in a laboratory state, which really contributed to the bias of, well, bisexual men, they don't really exist, which I suppose it's something where I need to put a content warning on this, that you may encounter me talking about the prejudices that people have experienced, but the problem with live streams is that it's a little hard to avoid going there, so I apologize in advance if I accidentally stumble into something and have to back up and say, oops, trigger warning. I'll try to remember to put a trigger warning in the repost of the description. But, anyway, for me, it's been the usual discovery process of, it seems like, pretty much every millennial. I assumed, well, I think I'm probably straight, but I encounter everything that assumes that sex with women, if you're a woman, is the norm, so I guess, but, I mean, you don't have to worry about how you orient yourself, because all the pornography I can find assumes bisexuality and women is the norm, and, I mean, there's some problems with getting your sex ed from porn, but the other sex ed I got was from my family, which was surprisingly rigorous and put me several steps ahead of my peers, but also had some parts which were not necessarily that useful, although, broadly speaking, the sex ed I got from my mother has been useful, ranging from always carry 2 condoms to don't do autoerotic asphyxia. You might end up killing your partner, and that's very dangerous. I would say that in my personal life, I do breath play, but I am very mindful of that and stick to the things that are completely safe. I don't do anything that would put my partner in danger of actually losing all their oxygen. And I am also risk aware of what I'm doing. Anyway, be that as it may, the actual formal sex ed I got through my school system was plant reproduction. So you can imagine that that was what it was in the early 2000s when I was at the stage where they thought that was necessary. By the way, if you're getting any weird sound distortions, I'm attempting to figure out the best possible way of getting my nice new microphone near me because I noticed everything I record tends to be super quiet. In this case, I've got the microphone sitting on my lap, so again, I apologize if it sounds like I'm recording in a potato. I actually have a really nice microphone, I just have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm working in a teeny tiny desk space where things are not the easiest to use. Anywho, the problem that I encountered with my identity was first of all parsing out what I was feeling to whom and how. Heterosexuality, as far as forming a deep attachment to someone, showed up along with puberty, but it was serially falling deeply in love with one person after another over a prolonged period of time. And desire, though I know that the policy right now is not to go too much into early childhood experience because it tends to be the gray area for writing stories about things happening to children, but definitely the sexuality showed up, but the sexuality showed up and was entirely oriented around kink. I had kinky fantasies before I had fully formed sexuality, and it kind of evolved from there. Basically, the kink showed up as aesthetics that I found deeply fascinating before I had anything that anyone would reproach as being a full sexuality, and then when the sexuality showed up, that's where it gravitated. Now, I grew up with the internet, and I grew up with a considerably more liberal attitude towards the concept of what you may and may not get your hands on. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have been in some of the spaces I was just for the comfort of the adults, and for that I do regret. But outside of that context, it did mean that I got access to a lot of information and got to explore large quantities of my sexuality in a space which was safe for me, if not necessarily safe for the poor people that I was doing it at, though I will note that during my late teens, it pretty was much clear that even though it was technically an adults 18 plus area that I was exploring, and no one was sharing pictures, by the way, it was entirely because nobody had the bandwidth for that sort of thing, and nobody had cell phones that had cameras in them at that point, so if you could share what you looked like, you probably had a webcam, or you had an expensive digital camera, or you could, mail someone a picture, but that was just like standard availability. And wow, it's weird to know that it's so easy to have a camera. I digress. Anyway, because I had this ready access to kink, and because I had a relatively liberal attitude towards sexuality, there was like the usual path of figuring out, like, am I bisexual? Well, I did have that joke that I used to tell people. I used to say I was bi-curious until after the number of women I'd had sex with, people were starting to think I was a slow learner. And in my case, I find that I do enjoy having sex with women in the sense that I tend to go very toppish swords lesbian, and I tend to go very toppish swords lesbian if the person is non-binary, and I tend to be like, dom, 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 let's see how I can push your buttons. Not necessarily the uber dom, but very much trying to get inside the other person's head, figure out how they work. That's just how my sexuality works with someone who's male. So I generally use bisexual just because it tends to function on a binary. There's two different tracks. There's the more mild topping, and then there's the, like, I am the dom topping. And with all that, there was still the huge stumbling block of a problem that we have with how we teach sexuality, which is that we tend to tell people to approach it from the angle of a particular kind of vanilla. Now, what we have as an education is really, really good compared with what it was. We've worked very hard to get across things like the clitoris is actually important. Most persons with vaginas do not come from vaginal penetration alone. you should probably touch her on the clitoris. You should make that the primary focus of where her orgasms would come from. You should touch her on her body all over. And I picked up all this information, and my partners picked up all this information, and my partners did their level best to be good, caring partners who did foreplay, and sex has, by and large, been excruciatingly painful, except for a few rare contexts, because no amount of vanilla foreplay is ever going to do it enough to be able to have me have sex properly, and it's not really going to bring me to orgasm either. My brain needs that kinky component, and I have a scope of fetishes, and I'm okay there, but that kind of is the process by which I discovered I think I might be ace. And it was one of those discovery processes where first you discover it is a thing, and I go around being like, wait, did you know that you could argue people whose sexuality is exclusively oriented around their kinks would classify as being asexual under the gray ace thing? And a bunch of people would yell at me that I was sexualizing asexuals, and this is the worst thing ever, and I'd asked this a few more times, and as a side effect of continuing to argue this point that, I noticed this thing, and I know a lot of kinky people where if you ask them whether they're gay or they're straight or they're bi, that's considerably less important to them than their practice of BDSM. Or they don't really want conventional sex. And I don't mean this in the, vanilla, I am far too kinky and complicated. I mean, that's very nice, but it just doesn't do anything for me. Now, as the person with the equipment that can be penetrated, this lack of information and lack of sex ed suggesting that it was possible that you could just not be into having sex. Like, there was information that told me that you could not be into being penetrated. That was provided to me as well. Some people with vaginas just don't like it. Some people have vaginismus. Nobody provided me with the information that it wasn't that you were straight, it wasn't that you were gay, it wasn't that you were trapped in a boring relationship with a bourgeois husband of your class and just waiting around for a nice woman of the working class with her rough, calloused hands to show you true love. No, there's just no information out there that's available. We don't even really give anyone sex ed involving BDSM unless they're lucky and they happen to pick up something on Scarletine. It's no wonder that TikTok is awash and people being like, hi, let me tell you what a safe word is. If someone ignores your safe word, they're abusive. And other things that, well, yes, if someone does have sex with you without your consent, they are abusive, yes. Like, I have more to say about, like, the way we use safe words is how we teach them is often wrong, and that maybe we shouldn't be teaching people from day one that they should be doing consensual non-consent by default, even though safe words are wonderfully good technology, and the stoplight system, or some variant of that, is great for calibrating, like, how it feels when you can't actually feel someone's nerve endings. But be that as it may, all this education is not provided to kinky people, and I think it causes serious problems of dysfunction that we never give people the opportunity to accept. By the way, your sexuality is okay, and your romantic side is okay, and they're not going to work unless you have these things. Different people have different ways they work around it, and for some people it really is like, I guess you could describe them as being bisexual in the terms of they have their fetishes and their fetishes are important to them, but they also have the ability to be attracted to people in the broader scope. Like I said, I can also be attracted to someone if I'm deeply in love with them, but that does not last if there is no kink in the relationship. That goes away very quickly. And honestly, I feel like the process of trying to get into someone's head when you're in love with them may be part of it. Like, I noticed some of my enjoyment of the experience with women tends to be because it's easy to go into a toppish space, which is not necessarily sadistic or not necessarily dominant, but it's got that figuring it out and doing thing that's very important to me. Now, it's perfectly possible I've got this all wrong and my identity is completely incorrect, and it's going to turn out that, oh no, you're actually perfectly normal, you're just a confused whatever it is vanilla person who just wandered in here. So don't take what I'm saying as gospel, but do consider this. If your sexuality or the connections you need to form a lasting romantic relationship with someone require there to be the presence of your kinks, then if it doesn't function otherwise, you meet the standard definition of gray ace aspec, or just ace or asexual for short as a topic heading. You're going to have a lot of trouble getting other people to understand this, but at least you won't feel quite so alone and weird when you try to explain your sexuality. And for me, this has been a really big thing. Now, it's also led to a lot of hilarious behavior from the progressive left people that I hang out with. Since we start talking about the variants of ace experience, people lose their goddamn minds. They turn into, like, the ace defender, and they assume that asexual people are these vulnerable, soft, sex-repulsed snowflakes lecturing you at length. Now, personally, I think that there's a certain degree of comedy when you're in a space where no good debate is going to happen anyway, and you're discussing with someone, and they leap out with the definition of blah, 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 this thing, have you considered that thing about transness, and you're both looking at each other, and they're like, but I'm thus and so, and then you look at them and you're like, but I'm also thus and so, and my interpretation is different, and you sort of butt heads whilst calling each other like, you're a horrible person, no, you're inconsiderate and a horrible person. No good discourse or discussion ever happens on Twitter. No good discourse or discussion ever happens on Facebook. They are a hellscape designed to make you feel rewarded by the attention of others. That is my conclusion. But it has been helpful for me to explore the reality that if you have your kinks in primacy to your sexuality and your romantic attractions, if you have either of those, you qualify for the ace label. And it's good to know that. It's still something that's so poorly understood that left-wing people get mad at me for sexualizing aces and how unreasonable and unfair I am. And I also have the fun of people yelling at me that I'm not supposed to use asexual. I'm supposed to say gray ace because otherwise they assume I mean a hard, like, null sexual, sex-repulsed person, which unfortunately, yes, that's a problem, and yes, there are biased languages that they use against asexual people, but if I had to describe asexual people in a, like, couple of words, incredibly horny seems to be just as much common as, oh, no, thank you, no, I'm not into it. So this is one of those things that's kind of bewildering and entertaining. This is probably going to be a short one, but I'm glad I got the point off and I got to test out my new microphone. Also, I'm trying to get back into the habit of streaming, and I'll try to think of something interesting to run on June. Maybe I'll put that up to my Patreon. If you enjoyed me talking about asexuality, please like and subscribe. Now, I'm probably going to give a more long-form piece on why kink not only belongs at Pride, but should be allowed not just in a special quarantine space at Pride, and how we talk about kink is profoundly fucked up and profoundly bigoted and incredibly discriminatory, and to be honest, really pearl-clutchingly pervy that you look at something that's essentially a subculture and decide that it is the dirtiest of lewd things, when mostly it's just really silly and you have to be into it to remotely find it sexual at all. But I will say, as a postscript for the asexuality thing, is it does make it an interesting dilemma when I'm writing porn, because the things that I necessarily find sexual in the context of, yeah, that gets my motor going when I'm writing about something, are not at all what I find other people will describe that. Like, when I wrote my most recent book, Corporate Conditioning, people really like it, and I think it's a good piece of writing. I describe it as an erotic romance, erotic, cyberpunk, mind control, femdom, office romance, no less. But the points that I found very erotic were the getting into the person's head in the story when the protagonist was trying to figure out the person she had as a prisoner for very much like, I've just come up with a logical reason why you can have a captivity fetish where you do brainwashing, but it's all okay. I make no excuses about that. But for other people, because there's only really a couple of points that would be clearly flagged as what they'd call sexual, this means that it doesn't necessarily flag as overtly as some people may experience. Anyway, it was lovely having you as an audience. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you later. Take care.